Are you feeling like you're behind in your retirement planning? If so, what can you do about it? Or do you feel like you're ahead of the game when it comes to retirement planning? And if so, what should you do about it? Well, stay tuned this week's episode of the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. And welcome to this week's episode of the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm David Scranton, here with my good friend and co-host, Sarah Samuels. And today, we're helping you determine whether or not you are ahead or behind on retirement, and in each scenario, what you could or should be doing about it. So we've got a great show in store here, Sarah. But first and foremost, how did you fare this crazy Noah's Ark situation this past week down here in Fort Lauderdale?
Oh, Dave, well, we barely made it through, luckily. And for our listeners and our YouTube viewers out there that aren't sure what we're talking about, Fort Lauderdale.
I think they probably heard about it on the news.
I'm sure they did. It was a national news story because
Sure.
the flooding was historic down here. And I'm sure people saw the airport pictures. Our airport was underwater. We're still dealing with the aftermath, actually. A lot of gas stations are out of gas. So it was rough, but luckily we were okay. And Dave, how did you fare?
I dealt with it really well. You know why?
Why?
Well, because I was up in my Connecticut office all week.
That's right. You
For
were
Easter.
in
That's
Connecticut.
right. I was in Connecticut. And when I started looking at the weather reports, I was in no hurry to come back to the Florida operation. So I got to spend a good week and a half up in the Connecticut operation and see family for Easter and everything.
Nice.
And I waited for it to dry out before I came back down here. But,
Yeah.
you know, maybe that's one of the reasons why people, if their goals are to retire in Florida, maybe it's one of the reasons they should consider re-examining it.
Yeah. Well, in fact, Dave, there's a new article out here that says the top 10 places to retire in Florida is actually not number one on the list. So maybe that has something to do with it, but we'll talk about that a little bit later in the show. Right now, Dave, I want to talk about this Fidelity survey that shows the majority of people surveyed, they're saying they are not ready for retirement. And that's really the reason why we decided to do this topic today, to make sure that you know what to do if you're not prepared and what you should do if you're actually ahead of the game here.
Yeah. And, you know, it's first of all, it's hard to tell if you're ahead or behind. That's the most important thing. And then, you know, what do you do in each case? And you might find that some of the things that you're tempted to do if you're ahead or behind might be counterintuitive, might be things that you don't want to do. But you certainly want to assess the situation and make sure that you have a feel for, hey, you know, am I winning the game? Am I losing the game? Do I need more points? You know, what do I need to do to get back to you know, where I want to be, because, you know, people are living longer and longer, right? There was recently in France, right, they extended the retirement age for their equivalent of Social Security and some of their pensions and so on from age 62 to 64. And there was a whole outcry.
Right.
You
There's rioting.
Right.
There's all kinds of things going on in France,
So I mean, call me crazy, but to me, you can put down the baguette, you can put down the croissant, you can work for 2 more years. It's not going to kill anybody. It's 64, not age 74, right? But that's happening. Why? Because people are living longer and longer lives, and as you live longer lives, you know, you need more money. So it's one of the stresses that people have these days when planning for retirement that maybe certainly our grandparents didn't have when life expectancies back then were a lot shorter.
Yeah. Well, I think the Europeans would say that's very American of you, Dave. Just work longer, make more money. Right. That's more of an American mindset.
That's right.
So, you know, if they don't do something about the Social Security situation, though, I hate to say it, we might see something similar here in the United States down the road. But
yeah. So I just was ordering some smoked fish from a place. Apparently it was French. I didn't know it over the weekend. And in French, it's poisson fumé, smoked fish, poisson fumé. And of course, I didn't know that, so I just said, "Can I get some of those poison fumes?" And you know, the waiter was on the floor laughing. So I better stick to finance, not languages, right?
All right. Well, we kind of talked about this a few minutes ago, the beginning of the show, about where you should retire and how do you figure out where you should retire. So this is great for our Ask Dave question. We actually have Ginny from California, and she says, "How do I determine where to live in retirement?"
Oh, okay.
Pretty good question.
Well, you know, a lot of things. I mean, it depends. If you're ahead of your retirement goals, then maybe, Jenny, you could, is it Ginny or Jenny?
Ginny.
Ginny, okay. So you can actually, you know, maybe have a little more luxury as to where you retire. And you could say, gee, I want to retire in Florida, or I want to retire in the mountains, or maybe I want to have 2 places if you're ahead of your goals, right? And you could do the snowbird thing. But if you're behind your goals, then it might be more about expenses and cost of living. In fact, Jenny, stay tuned. I want to tell you a couple stories later in this segment that that I've firsthand that I've heard that from clients and others that have really helped them stretch their retirement dollars by focusing on the cost effectiveness of living in a certain area.
Well, Jenny, thank you so much for sending in your Ask Dave question. And if any of our listeners or YouTube viewers out there have a question you want Dave to answer, just send us an email at askdave@retirementincomesource, SOURCE.com. And we appreciate you spending your weekend here on the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with Dave Scranton, and today we're talking about how to know if you're ahead or if you're behind in retirement and what to do in either scenario. So,
right.
Dave, we were just talking about the Ask Dave of Florida. We were talking about how Florida's not number one anymore for retirement places. Can you guess what the number one spot is to retire, the number one state?
Number one, let me guess. Let's say North Dakota.
You know what, Dave? North Dakota is actually on this list. It
Come
is
on,
number
really?
10.
Is it really? Okay.
Correct,
All
yes.
right.
Virginia is actually the number one place to retire according
Okay.
to this latest survey.
All right, there you go. Well, it's. I know for me, it's not France because obviously, if I'm ordering poison fumes, I'll starve to death if I try to retire in France. But yeah, and I think the Virginia move could be in part just the beauty of the mountains. It could be in part maybe some parts being closer to D.C. So people who want culture, or it could just be, the cost of living. Recently, I know somebody who retired and took over a year to figure out really where he wanted to live, and he thought it was Florida, and then he thought it might be the Northeast, and he really traveled around, and he settled on, the mountains in the Carolinas. And part of it was because a more balanced climate, so that it wasn't terrible in the winter in terms of snow, but in the summertime was a little cooler. And the cost of living, So for Jenny, it's that might be a decision, something that factors into the decision is saying, hey, if I don't want to spend a lot of money in retirement just on housing and on basic expenses, but I want my money to go further so I could do more fun things, then you have to take that into account.
Yeah. Well, the number one reason, or some of the big reasons why Virginia was ranked number one, it ranked 16th for affordability, 11th for both quality of life and healthcare, whereas Florida came in 9th in affordability and 4th in quality of life. But it was actually 28th place for healthcare.
So where was Florida overall?
Florida was number two.
Number two overall. Okay.
Yep.
So number two, and it's got weather, palm trees, all that kind of stuff. For many, they prefer the politics down here. Some hate it, but that's up to you. So the point is, it's a very individualized decision as to what you want to do. So I was just at Easter Sunday with a distant family member who lived in Long Island, New York, and went from a property tax bill of $15,000 to moving down to the Carolinas, and there go the Carolinas again, right? In a much bigger, newer home, and his property taxes went down from $15,000 to $1,500. And now he's got a boat on the lake, and he's living an incredible life, and he never could have lived that lifestyle had he stayed in New York. So it's nice that he has family up here, but he figured, hey, I could fly back here 4 or 5 times a year, and it's still a lot cheaper than trying to live here. So it's a big difference.
Yeah. Well, sadly, Dave, New York and Connecticut, your home state, neither of these are on the top 10 places to retire, probably for those reasons.
Oh, and for income taxes, too.
Income taxes, that's the other thing,
That's a big problem. So after the break, I want to find out more about, what we have there and what we can, some other states that might be on that list. You mentioned North Dakota, so that intrigues me. But when we come back, we're also going to be covering, what to do if you are feeling like you're behind on your retirement goals.
I'm Sarah Samuels here with Dave Scranton, and you're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. Welcome back to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with the host Dave Scranton, and today we're talking about retirement and how to know if you're ahead or behind in retirement, and really what your strategy should be if either is the case for you. So, but Dave, just a few minutes ago, we were talking about this list of where people should retire. So before we talk about if you're behind, let's go over this list a little bit and talk about some of these states.
I want to know which states are on the list. This is going to be North Dakota was on the list. So
yes.
You've intrigued me here. Let's hear about it.
All right. So as we mentioned, Virginia was number one on the list for affordability and healthcare costs overall. Florida was number 2.
Because you could drive your boat down the street in Florida, right?
That's right. You could, or kayak, paddleboard, whatever you choose, right?
That's good.
If you were here during the flooding, that's right. All right. So Colorado is number 3. That makes sense.
Okay.
It's a nice place, Colorado.
Yep.
Wyoming, number 4. Very
Okay.
nice. Delaware, number 5.
Mm-hmm.
Then we've got New Hampshire coming in number 6. South Dakota in number 7. Minnesota in number 8. Idaho in number 9. And North Dakota in number 10.
Interesting. So I think some of the things are about taxes, of course.
Right. Affordability, healthcare.
You don't
cost
see
of living.
California, Illinois,
No.
Connecticut, Massachusetts. You don't see New York, right? So part of it is certainly about taxes, but you see a lot of it's about lifestyle too. Most of these places are areas that, yeah, they might have a city, but they've also got lots of beautiful, more rural areas, so people can have a better lifestyle and maybe a more cost-effective lifestyle. It seems to me like most of these areas are a little bit more cost-effective than some of the areas I just mentioned. So that's interesting.
Yeah, and we know that's extremely important for retirees and near retirees. But Dave, if you are entering retirement and you're looking to live in a new state, somewhere you haven't lived before, what's the best way to really get a feel for a place? Because I feel like going for a week or so, that's not really enough time,
Right.
is it?
Right. No, it's not. And, I'll tell you what, one of the things that, for example, this fellow Steve did that bought the place in the mountains in North Carolina after almost a year and a half. It was really a mission that started before his retirement and went in past his retirement, where they just rented for a while and they would travel and they'd go to different places. And I've said many times it's a great idea to go somewhere, spend a month, right? Just get acclimated. And with Airbnbs today and vacation rentals by owner and all that stuff, you can actually rent a place, rent it for a month, live somewhere, and get a feel for the area, and then see where you want to live. And also talk to people. When you're there, talk to people who are natives. Say, hey, what do you like about living here? What do you don't like about living here? Give me the good, the bad, and the ugly. So in other words, really think about it. Most people are stuck, Sarah. They feel like, oh, well, I have to retire where I am today. Or some people feel like I have to retire where my family is, maybe where my kids and grandchildren. And if that's an absolute priority, well, then maybe that's the case. But, the reality of it today is like the fellow who came from Long Island, right? Yeah. He's got family up in New York and Connecticut, but the airfare is not that expensive to come back a few times a year. And what he saves in property taxes has an increased lifestyle. Right? Cost effectiveness is much greater than what it costs to go back and see people.
Yeah. And I think a lot of retirees, too, are looking at options like even using an RV. We saw a lot of that a couple years ago during the pandemic when you couldn't really travel anywhere. People were nervous about sharing public space with people. And an RV could be a great option, too, to drive around. You can travel and see your friends and family.
It could be a great option. And in these other places I mentioned, it also gives your children and grandchildren a great place to come visit. So they want to come see you because you've got the house on the lake in the Carolinas with the boat, or you've got the beautiful house in the mountains. And, it works. You just think it through. Don't be robotic. Think it through and be intentional about where you want to retire.
All right. Well, getting back on topic here with our what to do if you're behind in retirement, let's get into our Ask Dave question, because this is a great lead into it. So we have Carol. Carol's from Wyoming, which was actually on that list, number 4 for best places to retire.
That's right.
But Carol says, I feel like I'm behind in planning for retirement, but my advisor says I need to take more risk. What should I do?
Okay. Well, Carol, I never want to tell people to take more risk. Part of it has to do with your own personal risk tolerance. Can you sleep at night if you take more risk? And if you see your portfolio down 50%, that's part of it. But the other part of it really needs to be how far you are from retirement. So, Carol, if you're 15 years or more from retirement, or maybe even 10 years or more, taking a little more risk, if it's a smart risk to try to catch up, that's okay. Maybe that can work. But if you're within 15 years, especially within 10 years of retirement, you definitely do not want to do this, because one of the biggest myths, Carol and Sarah, is that, advisors say if you want to get more return on your investment, you need to take more
risk.
You take more risk, right? Everybody says that. Everybody's used to hearing that, and we've been brainwashed. But I want to talk a little bit, Sarah and Carol, about why that's not the case. Why there are cases where you can actually take less risk and get more return.
Yeah. Well, Carol, thank you so much for sending in your Ask Dave question. And if anyone out there has a question that you'd like Dave to cover on a future show, all you have to do is email us at askdave@retirementincomesource.com. And thank you so much for spending your weekend here with us on the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with Dave Scranton, and today we're talking about how to know if you're ahead or behind in retirement, and really what you should do to catch up, or if you're ahead to protect your assets. So Dave, everyone is used to this concept of you have to risk it all to really make that big return, but you just said it, you don't have to risk it all. So can you explain why you might not need to take as much risk as you think?
Sure. Well, there's really two examples. One is just last year, up until last year, really, bonds were kind of boring in most people's eyes because the bond yields were low, interest rates were low, and all of a sudden bonds are back in fashion now. People are talking about bonds, advisors are talking about bonds for their clients because the interest rates are higher. And when you have a bond, the beauty about it is you have two guarantees, right? In a bond portfolio, you have a guaranteed interest payment that you get on a regular basis, and when it matures, you have a guaranteed return of your face value, providing there's no defaults or bankruptcies. So providing no defaults or bankruptcies, you know exactly what you're going to earn in a bond portfolio, right? But even with bonds, Sarah, as we know this year, when the government hikes interest rates, that bond could drop in value on paper significantly. And now you're stuck holding it to maturity, however long that might be, to get the full face value back. So how can you offset that a little bit? Well, one of the things that you can do is actually offset some bond-like stocks. There are certain bond-like types of stocks that by integrating a little bit of that in a bond portfolio, you can actually lower your risk, increase your income payment, which you need when you're retired, income to replace your paycheck.
Replace that salary,
That's right.
Exactly.
And also increase your return. So increase your return, increase your income, and lower your volatility. So this is an area where you can actually lower your risk a little bit. Now, in how do you do that, right? You add a bond-like stock, a riskier
What is
thing.
a bond-like stock exactly?
Well, bond-like stock is something like, I consider a BDC to be a bond-like stock. I consider a REIT to be a bond-like stock. And probably beyond today's show as to why they're more bond-like. But those things on a standalone basis are riskier. But when you mix a little bit of those into a more conservative portfolio, you actually lower the risk. So here's a great analogy, okay? If I had two buckets of water sitting on the floor, one bucket's 33 degrees, right? It's so cold it's almost frozen. The other bucket's 211 degrees. It's so hot, it's almost boiling. If I put a gun to your head and said, you must put your foot in one of these buckets, which one are you going to pick?
I'm picking the cold water bucket.
Picking the cold water.
Yeah.
It's less harmful to your body, right? The 211, you're in there for 1 second, you're scalded, right?
Yep.
But what happens if you mix a little bit of that more dangerous 211-degree water into the 32-degree water? Just a little bit.
Well, you're going to get a more temperate water.
That's right. Now you have a mixture that's even better than either one, right?
Right, either option. It's a nice, comfortable temperature for you.
Right. But now if I had too much of that 211-degree water, now we get back to the scalding situation. So that's an area where you can add a little bit of the riskier thing to the more conservative thing and make it even more conservative. And the same is true in the financial markets. So again, in the world of bonds that are back in vogue, you can actually do this. You can actually take bond-like stocks that are a little bit riskier on a standalone basis, integrate those into a generally more conservative bond portfolio. And again, one more time, increase your income that gets paid out, increase your return, and decrease your overall volatility. Like this worked for us and our clients in 2021. 2021, we actually had the bond index was down overall, and we were up almost 10% because of this type of strategy. But coming up, Sarah, I want to talk about how you can also do that in the stock market, how lowering your risk and increasing your return, and you heard that right, lowering your risk and increasing your return isn't just a strategy in the bond market, it could also be a strategy in the stock market.
Perfect. All right. Well, we'll talk about that. I'm Sarah Samuels here with Dave Scranton, and you're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. You're listening to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels here with the host, Dave Scranton, and today we're talking about how to know if you're ahead or behind in retirement and what to do in either scenario. So, Dave, I think you might have blown our listeners and viewers' minds just a few minutes ago where you were saying you don't have to take more risk necessarily to get more return. You mentioned some ways that you can do this in the bond market, but you were telling us there's ways to do this in the stock market too. So you got to explain.
Sure. And, it's funny because, and I think maybe we did blow some minds talking about that, because we've all been brainwashed by the financial world, by our advisors, that the key is to take more risk. And that's one method of potentially getting more return. But if you don't do it the right way, you can lose more money also. But there are ways that you can get more return with less risk. And yes, we talked about the bond market. So how about stocks? Well, tell me, what's more conservative? A growth stock that doesn't pay a dividend, or a value stock that pays a significant dividend?
Well, going to be the value stock that pays the dividend.
That's right. Yeah. And so everybody knows that you can get more conservative when you go from a growth stock to a high dividend value stock. But what most people think is that you're giving up returns. And see, here is where that's not correct. You go back in history and you look at how much of the returns of a stock portfolio came from dividends. And the numbers are significant, right? We've all heard over the long run, Sarah, that stocks average 10%, let's say. That's
about 10%, yeah.
Everyone likes to tout that statistic. But if you go back in periods in history, depending upon the period you're looking at, anywhere between 30 and 50% of that came from dividends. But you have to look and say, well, wait a minute. Stock dividends are not 3 to 5% on average, right? The S&P 500 dividend is maybe 1.5%, right?
Right.
So how is it that 3 to 5 of that 10% comes from dividends? It doesn't make sense, does it?
Right. Yeah. How does that make sense, Dave? Explain the math.
The reason is because when you're in just growth, you're buying, whether it's tech stocks or whatever, and that stock drops in value, which all stocks go up and down at times, right?
They do, up and down.
So when it goes down, there's nothing good. There's nothing good about it. As we pilots would say, no joy, right? You're down, not a smiley face, the frowning emoji, right, where you're sitting here going, I'm just waiting for it to come back. Meanwhile, I am underwater and drowning, right? But when you're getting dividends paid out, those dividends can get reinvested now to buy more shares. And they buy more shares at a lower price. So it's like dollar cost averaging, right?
So it can actually be an opportunity.
That's right, because, see, when people are young, dollar cost averaging has a great benefit because you're putting a lot of money away, hopefully, and you have a small balance. But as you get near retirement, your balance gets much, much bigger, hopefully. And as a result, you need to, what you're putting in is a smaller percentage of your balance each year. So therefore, you don't have as much dollar cost averaging. Dividends can accentuate that dollar cost averaging. So if markets go straight up, well, then growth stocks over time typically do outperform dividend stocks. But we know that markets never go straight up.
Right.
And the more dips there are along the way, that gives an advantage to that dividend value strategy. So I'm not saying dividends and value are going to beat growth. But what I am saying is that you have to get a higher return in growth over the long run to match the performance of a lower return with dividends. So literally, you might have to say, well, I need to get 8% in a growth portfolio to match 6% in a high dividend value strategy. Because with the dividends, the math works for you. And when the market's down, you got something good happening. You're buying more shares with the use of those dividends. So again, just another way that you could potentially lower your risk and actually get a little bit more return, potential for more return, by letting the math work for you, not the risk.
So, Dave, we were talking about earlier what to do if you're behind in retirement,
Right.
some ways to catch up. And of course, this mind-blowing concept of you don't have to take more risk to get more return. But what if you think you're in pretty good shape? Like our next Ask Dave question here from Robert in Kentucky. Robert says, I'm about 10 years out from retirement. I feel like I'm ahead of the game. How do I avoid blowing my lead here, Dave?
Yeah, well, that's a great way to put it, Robert. Blowing your lead. I think about it as a sporting event where if you're behind, let's say you're playing basketball right now the NBA championships are going on and the playoffs. So if you're behind and you're in the last quarter of the game, you've got to shoot some more three-pointers. You've got to take some risks, right? And if you get really to the end of the game and you're behind, you intentionally foul people. And that's a big risk. And you hope that they're terrible free throw shooters. You foul them. They miss all the free throws. You get the ball back, right? So you're taking more risk because it's the end and you're behind. But, when you're up 20 points, it's the opposite, right? The team that's up 20 points with a few minutes left, they're trying to run out the clock, right? They're trying to hold on the ball. They're trying to make sure they don't make any unnecessary turnovers. They're trying not to foul. And they're just trying to play more defense than offense. So Robert, you're in a situation now, and hang on, because we're going to talk more about how to play defense more so if you're ahead of the game. So hang on and stay with us, please, because I want to cover that in just a minute, Sarah.
Yeah. Well, Robert, thank you so much for sending in your Ask Dave question. And if anyone out there has a question that you would like to get answered on the show, all you have to do is email us at askdave@Retirement Income Source. That's SOURCE.com. And thank you so much for listening right here on the Retirement Income Source, where it is all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels, and I'm here with Dave Scranton. And we have talked a lot on today's show about how to know if you're ahead or behind in retirement and the different strategies you should really employ depending on your situation. So Dave just answered a question from Robert out in Kentucky. Robert is lucky. He feels pretty good about retirement. But Dave, tell us some more specifics here. What should you be doing if you're playing defense? You're 20 points up. You got a couple minutes left in the game. What are the best ways to avoid messing up at the end?
Sure. So it depends on your risk tolerance. It depends upon how much your income you want by contract versus not by contract. So if you go to bonds and bond-like instruments, your income is contractual, right? And when I say contract, everybody automatically thinks about annuities because annuities are the ultimate income contract. But even bonds and bond-like instruments, you have a contract with an issuer. So you know that income's not going to change unless the issuer goes bankrupt. If you go to high dividend stocks, well, now the income could go up if the companies raise their dividends, but sometimes companies cut dividends, right, Sarah? So they can actually go back down, right? Yeah. So it depends upon your risk tolerance first in terms of how much you're willing to see your portfolio drop on paper, but it's also your risk tolerance about your income. So, Robert, what a lot of people do is they actually will say, okay, this is the amount of money I need in retirement, and I want to fund this between Social Security, any pensions if I'm fortunate enough to have one, and also through things that are invested by contract, like bonds and bond-like instruments, where I know that income's not going to change. Now, for the extra income, the difference between the, I need goals, what I need in retirement versus what I really want, maybe you're willing to gamble more on some of that stuff, right? So maybe for that, you go more to stocks and you count on dividends, knowing that the dividends could be cut, but at least they're not going to cut into the bone. They're not going to cut into your daily necessities.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think there's a lot that goes into it, and sometimes I think it can almost be more concerning if you're ahead of retirement, right? Because a lot of people, they don't know. They think, okay, if I have $2 million, $3 million, if I'm doing it this way, then that way, then I'll be okay, or I'll have enough in retirement. But like you say, Dave, it's really not about the dollar amount you have. It's really about changing your mindset and your transition and the way that you invest.
And I'm grateful to hear somebody by the name of Robert come in with that question, because men traditionally are the worst ones if they're ahead at making that paradigm shift from offense to defense, right?
Yep.
And think about how people are wired, generally speaking. And I know, in your household it's a little different. You're a little bit more aggressive than Justin, but in most cases, think about it. Women are more wired to be nurturers, to take care of their family. They're more conservative by nature. Men, it's like the hunter-gatherer. They're out there for the next kill, to hunt, right? So men are more aggressive. Testosterone makes us more aggressive, although you get to my age, your testosterone levels are in the toilet, but that's another story for another show.
That's another show.
but it's so to hear Robert come in and say, hey, what do I do? I think that's great, because men have the toughest time making that paradigm shift. Let's face it, for any of you men that have played sports, right? It's fun to rack up the score. If you've got 2 minutes left in that basketball game and you're up by 20 points, you want to see if you could win by 30, win by 40, right? You want to do it because it's fun, right? Yep. But that's not the smart thing to do, and that's why you have a coach. The coach is the one who pulls you on the sidelines and says, I see you shooting up a three-pointer, you're out. I'm pulling you out of the game. I don't care, right? So you need a coach, and for most men, that's true too. They need a coach. They may have been doing it themselves their entire lives as investors, but when they get to retirement and they're struggling mentally, emotionally, maybe even hormonally, like I mentioned, right?
That's absolutely true, right?
Making this paradigm shift from offense to defense, they need a financial coach, and a good financial advisor could be that financial coach. And so coming up, Sarah, I want to talk about now how you could determine if you're ahead or behind. And if you're looking for a financial advisor, a coach, how to determine if you have the right coach or the wrong coach.
I'm Sarah Samuels here with Dave Scranton. All that and more coming up on the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income.
And welcome back to the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm David Scranton here with Sarah Samuels. And we've got a great show. We have a lot more left. We're talking about how to determine whether you're ahead or behind on retirement and what you can do in each of those two situations. And so far, we talked about what to do if you're behind and a little bit about what to do if you're ahead. But also, we talked about how that old paradigm, Sarah, of you have to take more risk to get more return isn't as true as most financial advisors would lead you to believe.
Yeah. So Dave, why or how do people actually determine if they're ahead or if they're behind? Because it seems like that could almost be a subjective thing.
Yeah. Well, it is. So, the first thing you want to do is sit, and I'm going to give you, we did a whole show on this, Sarah, right? So I'm going to try to make this quick and concise. But so the first thing you want to do is figure out how much income you need and how much income you want in retirement. So for the I need goals, what I like to do is take your current income and figure out which expenses are going to go away in retirement. So let's say you're making $80,000 right now, but you subtract my 401k payment, maybe some commuting expenses, maybe my FICA tax that gets withheld from my paycheck because I don't have to pay that when I'm retired. And now I get down to $60,000. Well, or maybe I'm putting some money in a credit union, $10,000 a year. So now it's $50,000, right? So now my I need goal for today's lifestyle is $50,000 by taking what I'm earning and subtracting all the expenses that are going to go away in retirement. But then I have to sit back and figure out what I want, right? And this is where you get to dream and think about your retirement and be intentional. What are all the things we want to do? Because, Sarah, those that live a happier, more fulfilled retirement are those that are not moving away from a job they hate or a boss they hate. Right. They're moving towards something pleasurable that's intentional. There are things they want to do they haven't had the time to do, and retirement is going to afford them that time, right? Yeah. So you don't want to just be retiring because you hate what you're doing and you're trying to run, because that will lead to a retirement oftentimes of boredom, loneliness, and despair, right? Nobody wants those things.
Nobody wants that. You want to plan ahead, like you said, Dave, move towards something, have goals and ideas, and that's really where the I want comes in.
That's right.
I want to travel. I want to buy this boat or this new fancy car.
And then figure out reasonably how much that costs and add that to the I need income, okay? Now you get an I want income goal, all right? Then you've got to figure out what are your income sources. Do you have a pension? If you do, God bless you. There are not many people have those old-fashioned pensions anymore that pay you a monthly income as long as you live. Social Security, right? Then you have maybe rental income. You have rental property. Those are direct source of income. You want to subtract that from the I want goal. The remainder is what you need to get from your investments, right? And I would say if you need to get less than 4% a year from your investments in retirement in order to hit your I want goals, to fill the gap, then you're fine. You have enough points to win the game. If you need more than, let's say, 5.5%, then you're not fine by today's standards, and you're probably behind. All right. So again, it's real simple. To me, it's simple mathematics. I know my undergraduate degree's in math, so I think all math is simple. But it's really nothing. It's no trigonometry. It's no algebra. It's no calculus. It's simply addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, and being intentional.
Yeah, well, it might be simple for you, Dave, but personally, I think it's better not to try this at home. It's better to have the right coach, right? Especially once you get towards retirement. So our next Ask Dave question comes from James in Ohio, and he says, which advisors are the best coaches for retirement versus which advisors are just trying to sell me something?
Okay, great question, James.
I feel like James may have been hurt before by an advisor trying to sell him something in the past.
Yeah,
I don't know.
And I don't think the answer that's appropriate for radio would be to say, well, of course, one of our retirement income source advisors, right? That's not really appropriate for a radio show.
Our income specialists are a great resource. That's absolutely true.
So the real answer, James, is first of all, you want to work with a fiduciary. Okay, some advisors are held to a standard that's lower, where they just have to make a recommendation for you that's reasonable. It can't be overtly bad. It's got to be reasonable. But it doesn't have to be the best recommendation. You can line up 5 recommendations, and if it's number 2 or 3, it's fine, right? If you hire a fiduciary by definition has to do the best thing for you that they can. So the first step is work with a fiduciary. How do you know? Well, if you're paying commissions, you're not working with a fiduciary. If you're paying a management fee, then you're working with a fiduciary, okay? But now all fiduciaries are not born equal also. So James, stick around because later on in the segment, we're going to talk more about how to dig deeper and how to look beyond just, okay, I checked the box, it's a fiduciary I'm working with, but how do I look beyond that and know that it's the right fiduciary for me?
Yeah. James, thank you for sending in your question. And if anyone out there has a question you want Dave to answer, send us an email at askdave@retirementincomesource.com. And thank you for spending your weekend here with us on the Retirement Income Source, where it's all about the income. I'm Sarah Samuels, and I'm here with Dave Scranton, and we are talking about how to know if you're ahead or behind in retirement and what you should do in either case. And most importantly, having the right coach once you're in retirement to make sure your money will last you all throughout retirement. So, Dave, not all fiduciaries are created equal. Now, what do you mean? We understand the difference between the suitability standard, right, versus the fiduciary standard. Right. But how do you know it's the right fiduciary for you?
Well, there's a couple of things you have to look at. First of all, what stage of life does that person specialize in, okay? Is it a pediatrician? Is it a primary care doctor? Or is it a gerontologist that focuses on older folks, right? Yeah. You want, essentially, and I know people retiring today in their 60s don't want to think of themselves as being older, right? The 60s is the new 50s or maybe the new 40s, who knows? But
hey, when you're living to 90 or 100, then it's not too old anymore.
In some ways, that's right. Yeah. That's right. And you're only as old as you feel, right? That's what they say. So part of it is but even then you want to be working with a gerontologist. You want to be working with somebody that focuses on not getting people into retirement, but taking people through retirement. And most financial advisors are sorely not equipped, okay? So for example, when I talk about lowering your risk in the bond market and increasing your yield and increasing your return, like we talked about earlier in the show, you have to have you have to understand the world of bonds and bond-like instruments. So first of all, if somebody's going to put you in bond mutual funds, that tells you right then and there they don't understand bonds, because bond mutual funds aren't bonds. There's two guarantees I talked about earlier in the show that attract retirees to bonds. They're off the table when you buy bond funds, because a bond fund is essentially a stock of a company that owns bonds.
Right. It's basically a mutual fund.
So if that advisor is going to have any bond funds or bond ETFs in your account, that tells you they're not a true income specialist. They're more of a specialist for somebody in their accumulation years when you're younger, where they're just putting some bonds in there because they don't want to have 100% of it in stocks. So they use bond funds. Okay. A lot of those people in the accumulation years don't really understand how to reduce the risk of a bond portfolio by integrating some bond-like stocks like the BDCs and the REITs. Okay? A lot of them, if you ask the question outright, are going to say, well, if you ask them, what's going to do better over the long run, a high dividend value stock or a growth stock? If they say growth stock, well, then it tells you that they're really not in the income game. They're in the accumulation game. So if you're more than 10 or 15 years out of retirement, maybe that's okay. If you're within 10 or 15 years of retirement or retired, then it's not okay. They're the pediatrician, and you don't want to work with a pediatrician. You want to work with somebody who's appropriate for that income stage. So great to ask them if they, number one, how much income they generate on their investments. Number two, if they use bond mutual funds at all. It's great to ask them, how do they lower risk in a bond portfolio and see if they understand the concept of bond-like stocks. And also, what earns more? A growth stock or a portfolio of high dividend value stocks, and see what they say. Yeah. And that'll tell you, their level of knowledge.
Yeah. I think it's also important to work with an income specialist or an advisor that also educates you and thinks that's important, because like you say, Dave, all the time, you're your own best steward of your own money. So it's important to work with someone that feels that's important, I think.
As much as I care about my clients, I tell my clients all the time, nobody cares more about your money than you do, and that's just the way it is. So, So here's the other thing too, Sarah, I think, when it comes to how some fiduciaries are different. Some fiduciaries just ask you they give you a risk tolerance questionnaire, and they ask you questions about your risk. Maybe there's 15, 20, 30 questions, and how much of a loss you can stand to take. And the problem with that questionnaire is that it's really just to cover the rear. What they do is they take those answers, they put it into a computer program. The computer program pops out and says, okay, of the 5 or 7 portfolios that we offer, portfolio number 3 is right for you. But that's not a true fiduciary. That's somebody who is really selling 5 or 7 different portfolios and trying to figure out which portfolio to sell you. Right? I've got 5 different Chevrolets to sell you. Ask you some questions. Which Chevrolet makes the most sense?
But Dave, I want a Toyota. you can only sell me Chevrolets, right?
That's right, because they're selling, even though they legally are a fiduciary, they're still selling you one of their 5 or 7 portfolios. A true fiduciary gets to know you and customizes the portfolio based upon your I want goals, based upon your I need goals, and based upon your propensity for risk, and whether or not you're ahead or behind on your retirement goals.
Yeah. Well, thank you to all of our listeners and our viewers out there spending your weekend with us. If you want to listen to the show again, or maybe even send it to your friends or family, all you have to do is go to retirementincomesourceradio.com for all of our past episodes.
Yeah, and please send your friends and family. We'd love them to join us. We always love new listeners. But most importantly, thank you for being here with us today, and we hope you join us next week. I'm David Scranton here with Sarah Samuels, and this is the Retirement Income Source, where it truly is all about the income.